Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, President Trump sends a direct warning to Russian President Vladimir Putin after a deadly attack on Ukraine's capital city. Arian Pazdar has what Trump says about putting pressure on Russia. A new clash over whether the U.S. and China are talking. Trump refuting Beijing's claim that negotiations have not been happening. He's also issuing fresh warnings for countries that refuse to make a deal. Iris Tao at the White House. A judge is ordering the Trump administration to facilitate the return of another Venezuelan immigrant who was deported to El Salvador. The Iranian regime consulted the Chinese Communist Party ahead of negotiations with the U.S. on Iran's nuclear program. Luis Martinez takes a closer look at how the CCP has extended a lifeline to the Iranian regime. A documentary exploring the Chinese regime's practice of forced live organ harvesting is screened at a D.C. university. Audiences calling for a stop to the CCP's human rights abuses.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. President Trump today talking about putting pressure on Russia. Trump sent a direct warning to Russian President Vladimir Putin. At least 8 civilians are reported dead in Ukraine's capital city of Kyiv after a Russian attack. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pazdar has the Ukraine update.
Putting a lot of pressure on Russia, and Russia knows that, and some people that are close to it know.
President Trump on Monday answering questions from reporters after a deadly attack on Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv. The reported attack comes as Trump continues efforts to negotiate a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine.
Mr. President, why are you not putting more pressure on Russia? I know a lot of Europeans...
Putting a lot of pressure. You don't know what pressure I'm putting on Russia. They're dealing. You have no idea what pressure I'm putting on Russia. We're putting a lot of pressure.
Trump's comments come after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called for more pressure on Russia after Thursday's attack. He wants the U.S. to ramp up the peace efforts.
I don't see strong pressure on Russia, nor new sanctions packages against their aggression.
Ukraine says Russia pounded Kyiv with almost 150 drones and 70 missiles. At least 8 civilians are reported dead and over 70 injured. Zelensky says Russia used a North Korean missile for a strike on a residential building. Trump was asked about Russia's willingness to negotiate peace.
What concessions, Mr. President, and to your national security team, what concessions has Russia offered up thus far to get to the point where you're closer to peace?
Stopping the war. Stopping taking the whole country. Pretty big concession.
Shortly after the Thursday attack, President Trump took to social media, directly addressing Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump says, "I am not happy with the Russian strikes on Kyiv. Not necessary and very bad timing. Vladimir, stop."
President Trump, sir, today you told Vladimir Putin to stop with the attacks. Do you think he'll listen to you?
Also on Thursday, NATO Secretary Mark Rutte is meeting with high-level Trump administration officials in Washington. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others welcomed Rutte in D.C. Before the meetings, the Financial Times reported that Rutte planned to urge U.S. officials not to force Ukraine to accept a peace deal against its will. But Rutte later commented,
"Is it accurate to say that you urged U.S. officials not to pressure Ukraine into accepting a peace deal that favors Russia?"
No, it's not accurate, no.
Rutte was also asked whether he thinks Putin actually wants peace. The NATO chief says that he doesn't know and that he, quote, stopped trying to read Putin's mind. Arian Pazdar, NTD News.
President Trump clashing with China over whether trade talks are taking place. While Trump says the two sides just met this morning, China says nothing has happened yet. Meanwhile, the first deal could come soon with another Asian country. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. What is the latest on U.S.-China talks?
Good evening to you as well, Tiff. So the U.S. and China are now having a new clash over whether or not trade talks have taken place between the two countries yet. President Trump today outright refuted China's latest claim that the two countries have not had any negotiations over the heightened tariffs yet. Instead, President Trump said just this morning his trade team met with China's team. Watch.
Well, they had a meeting this morning, so I can't tell you. It doesn't matter who they is. We may reveal it later, but they had meetings this morning, and we've been meeting with China.
And President Trump, who was hosting the Prime Minister from Norway today at the White House, answered reporters' questions but did not specify who was at that meeting, though he says he might reveal it later. And meanwhile, China's narrative that no talks have taken place yet comes just a day after Trump said yesterday that the two countries are talking every day. And Trump today also reiterated his threat that even if countries like China don't come to a deal with the U.S. might just well impose tariffs unilaterally. Watch.
We are going to, at some point, just set prices for deals. Some will be tariffed. Some treated us very unfairly. They'll be tariffed higher than others. But we've been ripped off for many, many years.
But negotiations are proceeding fast with other countries. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent today told reporters that South Korea could be the first country to strike a deal with the Trump administration. Watch.
We will be talking technical terms as early as next week as we reach an agreement on understanding as soon as next week. So South Koreans came early, they came with their A game, and we will see if they follow through on that.
And we know that the Trump administration has been trying to negotiate regional trade deals with some of China's regional neighbors, including, for example, South Korea and Japan, that to add pressure for Beijing. Tiff.
And Iris, the president today also signed new executive orders. What are those about?
Sure. So the president this afternoon signed several new executive orders, including one on election integrity. That's to target foreign donations in U.S. elections. The White House is citing an investigation targeting the Democratic fundraising organization Act Blue over what they're calling significant fraud campaigns, potentially. And meanwhile, also on energy, Trump signed an order to slash the years-long permitting process for energy projects to now just 28 days. He's also unveiling a new drilling project in what the White House is calling the Gulf of America. And both actions, the White House says, are aimed to boost energy production and reduce energy costs for everyday Americans. Tiff.
All right, Iris, thanks for those updates. President Trump says his right to impose tariffs are enshrined in law and were motivated by the fentanyl crisis and border security. But some states have filed a new lawsuit challenging that right.
The president has absolutely no legal authority to issue these tariffs.
A group of 12 states is suing the Trump administration over the president's use of tariffs. It's taking the matter to the U.S. Court of International Trade. President Donald Trump claims he can impose tariffs single-handedly due to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It gives the president authority to respond to unusual and extraordinary threats.
We started with the fentanyl border tariffs. The IEPA is also used for the trade deficit.
The lawsuit argues that's an overreach. It notes the Constitution gives Congress the power to collect taxes and duties. U.S. businesses have to pay applicable tariffs on imports. Experts say they often pass on some or all of that expense to consumers in the form of higher prices.
Arizona cannot afford this Trump tax increase.
The lawsuit comes as Trump is warning negotiations during his 90-day pause on so-called reciprocal tariffs might not last 90 days in some cases. He says he might have some rates settled in 2 or 3 weeks.
We're going to have great deals. And by the way, if we don't have a deal with a company or a country, we're going to set the tariff.
The Trump administration has been ordered to facilitate the return of another Venezuelan immigrant who was deported to El Salvador. U.S. District Judge Stephanie Gallagher ruled the removal of the 20-year-old violated a court settlement that protects some immigrants with pending asylum claims. The plaintiff's legal team says the man, identified as Christian in court filings, was sent to an El Salvador prison last month. The administration says the deportation wasn't a violation of the settlement. The Chinese Communist Party has created a network of international oppression by propping up regimes across the world that have wreaked havoc in their respective regions. NTD Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has details of how the CCP has extended a lifeline to the regime of the supreme leader of Iran.
A handful of rogue regimes has upended the world order, and whether it is transnational criminal organizations being directed from the Palacio de Miraflores by the Venezuelan regime, or a network of terrorist organizations being led by the Iranian regime in the Middle East, or the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian army, what all these three have in common is the backing of the Chinese Communist Party. When it comes to the regime in Iran, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei began building what it calls the axis of resistance to Israel and U.S. influence in the region since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And in 1982, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, also known as IRGC, began what is now today known as Hezbollah in Lebanon. In 1987, the IRGC funneled money to Hamas in the Gaza Strip to help their beginnings, and as well as in 1992, sending millions of dollars to the Houthi movement in Yemen. And in 2003, after the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, the IRGC began funneling money to Iraqi militias fighting against U.S. interests and Israeli interests in the region. The links in between the Chinese Communist Party and the Iranian regime date back to the beginnings of the Islamic Revolution, but have intensified since 2017 when the Chinese Communist Party and Iran have been holding annual military exercises. And it's also believed that the Chinese Communist Party is training Iranian military officials on advanced weapon systems as well as transferring missile technology to the IRGC. In 2021, the Chinese Communist Party also signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran, and it is reported that the agreement included a $400 billion investment pledge from the CCP on Iranian projects. That same year, the CCP secured Iran's inclusion into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So the Chinese Communist Party's international network of oppression works this way. The CCP buys oil from Russia, Iran, and Venezuela at discounted prices. Now, these cash inflows not only help these three regimes survive, but also help these three regimes do as such. In the case of Iran, Iran can funnel money to Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the militias in Iraq. The Russian regime can use that cash inflow and buy Iranian-made drones that are being used in the war against Ukraine. And the Venezuelan regime is also buying Iranian-made drones, making it the only South American country with advanced weapon systems. The links in between the Chinese Communist Party and the Iranian regime are so strong that this week the Iranian foreign minister traveled to Beijing to consult with the Chinese Communist Party ahead of the Iranian regime's talks with the United States government over their nuclear program. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
A documentary exposing the Chinese regime's crime of forced organ harvesting was screened last night at George Washington University in D.C. It was just days ahead of the 26th anniversary of a historic peaceful appeal in Beijing. NTD's Sam Wong has the story.
Friday, April 25th will mark the 26th anniversary of a historic peaceful appeal in Beijing. On that date, in 1999, over 10,000 Falun Gong practitioners lined up outside the Chinese Communist Party's central compound, responding to a sudden repression by local authorities. But no one knew at the time that this group of people would be the subject of a nationwide persecution campaign involving the practice of forced live organ harvesting. An independent documentary called State Organs is exploring this crime against humanity.
This is a film that I think really allows people to understand the severity of this crime, that these are really good people that this is happening to. So I think it's kind of a wake-up call for people.
A screening and discussion of State Organs was held Wednesday at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. The documentary follows two Chinese families in their decades-long search for their missing relatives. Their journey uncovered a state-backed organ harvesting operation that has targeted many innocent people.
The details of it are pretty scary, though, because it's clearly it's not a horror show, it's real.
China has no respect for human rights. They're really the modern equivalent of the Nazis, and people use that comparison all the time. Well, this is a real one.
Today, many Falun Gong practitioners in China are subjected to incarceration, torture, and abuse in custody. According to several international human rights organizations, an untold number of them have been executed on demand to supply the regime's organ transplant industry.
Just like the scale of it, that is happening to so many people, and it's happening to victims without anesthesia, that they're never in contact with their families again, they're just vanished. That's horrifying, and it makes me want to do something. So I feel more, after watching this film, I feel like I have to do something.
Earlier this year, lawmakers in both chambers of Congress reintroduced the Falun Gong Protection Act, a bill that would mandate sanctions on anyone involved in the Chinese regime's crime of forced organ harvesting. Sam Wang, NTD News, Washington, D.C.
In light of President Trump's executive order requiring colleges and universities to disclose their foreign funding, what are the national security implications of foreign countries funding America's education institutions? We'll have insights from Michael Lucci, founder and chief executive officer of State Armor Action. Tune in at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for NTD's Capitol Report. Coming up, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. candidly speaks at a drug summit today about his experience with addiction. Arlene Richards with the latest. An update on the New Jersey wildfire. Authorities have arrested a teenager and claim his bonfire erupted into the devastating blaze. David Lamb reports. And California has surpassed Japan to become the fourth largest economy in the world. Christina Corona highlights the state's economic growth and global standing after the break. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. made a special appearance today at a drug summit in Tennessee. He reflected on his own journey as a heroin addict and how his faith in God helped him to end the habit. NTD's Arlene Richards has more on his speech.
Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. spoke on Thursday at the 2025 RX and Illicit Drug Summit in Nashville, Tennessee. He shared insights into the nation's opioid crisis as well as his own struggle with addiction. Although he was raised in a staunchly religious family, Kennedy was introduced to drugs during a weak moment in his life at age 15.
I was hitchhiking home from that party, and an older boy who I knew but only vaguely picked me up, and he offered me a tab of LSD.
Kennedy said that first experience led to a lengthy addiction.
And by the end of the summer, I was shooting heroin, which was my drug of choice for the next 14 years.
Despite his religious upbringing, Kennedy said the road to sobriety was difficult.
I tried earnestly, sincerely, and honestly to quit constantly. I made pledges to my brothers, to my friends, to my family. I took vows. I wrote out agreements and contracts. I saw a psychiatrist.
He said he did everything he could think of and nothing worked. Kennedy said eventually he was able to join a 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous program, and he knew he needed a spiritual awakening.
Because I did not want to be the person that I was.
He was inspired by a book written by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, who was very interested in proving the existence of God. Kennedy said, according to Jung, people who believed in God got better faster.
So I just made a decision. I'm going to start believing in God.
Kennedy said despite some reservations about the existence of God, he started behaving as if God was up there, which encouraged him to keep commitments and build his moral character. Prior to speaking at the summit, Kennedy recently renewed the 2017 Opioid Public Health Emergency Declaration addressing the opioid crisis. The summit brought together a broad cross-section of stakeholders and thought leaders to tackle the crisis. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
Authorities have arrested an individual suspected of causing the New Jersey wildfire, expected to be the state's largest in 2 decades. They say they believe the fire was set intentionally. NTD's David Lamb reports.
As of Thursday, the Jones Road fire in New Jersey has burned about 15,000 acres in Waretown and Lacey townships and has destroyed a commercial building. It is 50% contained. Joseph Kling, a 19-year-old, faces aggravated arson charges as the blaze continues to burn in southern Jersey, expected to be the state's largest wildfire in 20 years. Authorities arrested Kling, who's from Waretown, and accuse him of purposely starting a bonfire on Tuesday. Law enforcement determined that the cause of the wildfire was a bonfire that hadn't been put out. Authorities say part of the fire had reached a nuclear plant, but believe it was put out, saying they'll continue to monitor the situation. No injuries or deaths have been reported so far, but about 5,000 residents had been evacuated but were later permitted to return home. Higher than normal pollution levels were expected in New York City, Rockland, and Westchester counties. Long Island's Nassau and Suffolk counties were expected to be impacted as well. The fire is roughly 54 miles south of the Big Apple. David Lamb, NTD News.
The Chicago man who killed 7 people during a 2022 Independence Day parade has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His sentencing followed emotional testimony from survivors and the relatives of those he shot and killed. Lake County Judge Victoria Rossetti handed down 7 consecutive life sentences to Robert E. Cremo III, as prosecutors had requested. Rossetti also sentenced Cremo to 50 years on each of the 48 counts of attempted murder to be served consecutively. Some survivors described feeling empty or depressed in the years since the shooting. Others say they no longer attend public gatherings. During sentencing, the judge called Cremo, quote, irretrievably depraved, permanently incorrigible, irreparably corrupt, and beyond any rehabilitation. Governor Gavin Newsom announced that California has officially surpassed Japan to become the 4th largest economy in the world. The state's economy now ranks just behind the U.S., China, and Germany. NTD's Christina Corona reports on this major economic milestone.
If California were its own country, it would now rank as the 4th largest economy in the world. That's according to Governor Gavin Newsom, who says the state's economy hit $4.1 trillion just last year. Governor Gavin Newsom announced Wednesday that California has officially surpassed Japan to become the 4th largest economy in the world, based on new data from the International Monetary Fund and the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. The data shows that California's nominal gross domestic product has reached $4.1 trillion. This means the Golden State has now surpassed Japan, whose GDP sits at $4.02 trillion. California trails the United States, China, and Germany in total economic output. According to Newsom's office, California is also the fastest growing economy. In 2024, the state's nominal GDP grew by 6%, outpacing the U.S. growth rate of 5.3%, Germany's 2.9%, and China's 2.6%. Governor Newsom also highlighted the economic impact of major cultural events like Coachella and Stagecoach. He said these festivals bring in $700 million annually while boosting tourism, supporting local jobs, and helping small businesses thrive. While celebrating the milestone, Newsom also criticized President Trump's tariff policies, saying, "While we celebrate this success, we recognize that our progress is threatened by the reckless tariff policies of the current federal administration. California's economy powers the nation, and it must be protected." According to Newsom's office, California is a top agricultural producer in the U.S. The state also leads in manufacturing with over 36,000 firms that employ more than 1.1 million people across the state. Reporting from the city of El Monte, Christina Corona, NTD News.
Coming up amid trade tensions, China's communist regime is retaliating against U.S. tariffs by restricting imports of Hollywood films. Film producer and author Chris Fenton joins us to discuss that and the latest developments in the trade war. And critical energy infrastructure has become a potential battlefield for the Chinese Communist Party. Lawmakers and experts look into the dangers of using energy equipment built by China. That and more when we return. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. President Trump said today that trade talks between the U.S. and China are underway, pushing back against Chinese claims that no discussions have taken place to ease the ongoing trade war. This comes after China's communist regime retaliated against U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods by restricting imports of Hollywood films. Joining us now to discuss is film producer Chris Fenton. He's the author of the book Feeding the Dragon: Inside the $1 Trillion Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Business. He's also a professor at the University of Southern California. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you again. I want to get to the movie part, but first, with the latest developments, Beijing is saying that if the U.S. wants trade talks Washington needs to completely cancel all unilateral tariff measures. What do you expect to see from the U.S. in response, given, say, the softer stance from both Trump and Bessent lately, saying that the tariffs won't stay at their current rate?
Well, I think it's an interesting conundrum right now, because if you look at the weaknesses that China has in terms of, for instance, scarcity issues, whether it's food, commodities, energy, water, et cetera, they have a problem combined with that, with their economy, that it's slowing. And on top of the fact that they have become very dependent as a creditor to the U.S. in terms of lending us money. So there's a lot of there's a relationship that is very, very reciprocal on both sides. So they have to figure out exactly where their leverage points are. And then if you're looking at Trump, he's probably looking at the art of the deal, which is something that if he's looking at, say, the art of war, deception, timing, and surprise are going to be crucial. So he may be saying things that are staking out essentially where the plan is going, what the strategy and tactics are going to be, but he might be actually thinking of activating things on a completely opposite scale. And that will hopefully allow him to get the leverage he needs in order to get some of the concessions that they're looking for out of Beijing.
It is true that, these are the two biggest economies. They are very intertwined. Some are talking about how hard it would be to decouple. On that note, we are seeing Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent recently saying that China can move its economy away from export overcapacity and towards supporting its own consumers and domestic demand, and that the U.S. wants to help it change. Now, China expert General Spalding pointing out on X that, quote, "But China won't change. It has always been ideological. They are and always will be Marxists." Now, Chris, you've had your own journey in discovering that, from, say, the hope of China opening up and becoming more democratic to realizing that America's own future could be at stake if it remains business as usual. Talk to us about that.
Well, I think the biggest thing I learned over time was really a couple things coming out of Beijing. Number one is they can play a game of chess by playing the long game, whereas we're constricted here in the U.S. of sort of playing a game of checkers based on all kinds of different pressures that are put on leadership here, particularly with a 2 to 4 year election cycle and the constant gyrations of stock markets, bond markets, and various other free market capitalistic players that are in the essentially in the sphere that they have to pay attention to. On top of that, we have a free press that's constantly grinding our leadership on what their everyday decisions are. Whereas in China, Xi doesn't have to listen to anybody. All he has to do is put the attention on how to maintain power and how to maintain influence over his 1.4 billion people so they don't rise up and revolt. So a lot of that is helped constrain any sort of dissension among its people through narrative and through the way his decisions are disseminated through the public via the press, information, television, film, etc. So as long as he has control over those narratives, he can make people think that the system is working well for them, even if particular parts of the system aren't working on a day-to-day basis. And that's a huge advantage that they have on us here in the US. But we do have lots of leverage points, which we can get to next.
Very different playing fields, to your point. When it comes to retaliation to the tariffs, China stopped exports of 7 rare earth metals and magnets, which are crucial to our U.S. defense industry, as well as slashing Hollywood imports. Now, it seems since the pandemic, Hollywood hasn't fared as well in the Chinese market. So how big of an impact is this move by China?
Well, the impact by China is not all that large because, quite frankly, they got out of us what they needed from us in terms of the way we produce films and television. They learned how to do it themselves, right? We needed to fill their theaters as they were going from, say, 5,000 screens in 2008-9 to the 90,000 that they have today. Hollywood films were the best way to do that. We allowed them the ability to learn our process, steal our IP, force JVs, tariff the heck out of us as far as all kinds of export taxes, and the fact that we only got 25 cents and actually back in 2008, only 13 cents of every dollar that was made over there. We allowed them to do all of that, and learn from us how to be best in craftsmen when it comes to actually making Hollywood type movies. And now they do it the best themselves. So we've seen this market go from essentially 80% of US titles back in, say, 2009, 2010, down to about 5% today. So just taking that 5% trough away from Hollywood is not going to create that big of a problem for us. And it's really not a pressure point for China anymore.
Expanding on that, in the entertainment arena, you have Netflix's co-CEO saying that they're not in China because not a single episode cleared the censorship board there, adding, quote, "They had no interest in us being in China. I watched everyone spend the next decade grinding out all their time to get into China and ultimately ended up in the same place I did, which was nowhere." Talk to us about the reality of doing business in China. You touched on that a little bit, but say the censorship, IP theft, arbitrary detention. Is there almost a sense that companies are now seeing China as too risky to invest in?
Well, the reality is Netflix did try to get into China at one point, but they realized it was going to be very difficult to get in there. So they sort of gave up on it way earlier than most of their competitors, which was a smart move. If you look at the way these companies are approaching China today versus where they were about 10 years ago, you're seeing this idea that maybe the golden goose is still there and there's still a market to try to keep some sort of status with, or some sort of stasis or status quo in terms of placating investors and shareholders and Wall Street, that they still do have a market in that market. But they're also pulling back on investing in the PRC, and they are starting to look elsewhere to start essentially showing where their growth projections can go. It's a very delicate balance, because the second a China issue arises, especially with companies like, say, Nike or, say, Tesla, that are very exposed to the market, the most shuddering among shareholders occurs. So there's this delicate balance of bringing back investment, bringing back an emphasis of China so that it's not out there in the forefront, yet also trying to hold on to what you got in order to still derive some revenues from what is the largest market in the world.
A lot of changes here for sure. Chris Fenton, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we've done extensive coverage on this issue. If you want to dive deep into China's control in the film industry, watch our NTD original documentary, Hollywood Takeover. You'll learn more about Chris and his journey, taking place in the middle of a soft power conflict between U.S. companies and China. You can watch that documentary on epictv.com. A congressional commission analyzed the risks of using energy infrastructure built by China. One commissioner said that this sector has been a potential battlefield for the CCP. NTD correspondent Jason Blair has the key takeaways.
In a hearing, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission focused on the situation and risks of China's role in critical mineral supply chains, fossil fuel markets, and overseas clean energy infrastructure investments.
Officials in capitals around the world are now investigating the risks of Chinese investment and control over critical electrical infrastructure. Chinese manufactured hardware could introduce hidden vulnerabilities such as remote kill switches and data collection capabilities.
And Mr. Brand says that recent intrusions by state-sponsored actors into critical U.S. infrastructure like Volt Typhoon serve as indicators of China's capabilities and intents.
When the United States raised concerns about these cyber operations last December, Chinese officials reportedly linked these activities to geopolitical tensions over Taiwan, a sobering reminder that energy infrastructure has become a potential battlefield in great power competition.
Senator Clark Goodwin says that China accounts for 2/3 of the world's wind and solar power projects that are under construction.
China positions itself as a climate champion, but in reality, it has been the world's largest annual emitter of carbon dioxide for almost 20 years.
The hearing also focused on China's global dominance in critical mineral supply chains and the risks of countries being dependent on China for them.
There are strong indications that China is consolidating its hold over critical minerals and is prepared to use its position as geopolitical leverage amid escalating trade tensions.
Yet critical minerals are perhaps the most vivid illustration of how Beijing leverages its central position in energy supply chains to support state interests.
Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
A think tank urges London to preserve the U.S.-UK special relationship. This would mean a strategic alignment with President Trump's new economic and security directions for America. China policy could be a key factor to determine whether Britain remains a key ally, with Chinese investment in key UK assets among the concerns. NTD's international correspondent Malcolm Hudson has more for us from London.
Trump's second term as president presents a decisive shift in U.S. foreign policy under his America First doctrine. In a new report for the Henry Jackson Society, Associate Fellow Darren Spink says this means heightened demands on Britain to respond and align swiftly with his priorities, particularly in regards to defense, trade and China. Failure to do so, he says, risks the UK's status as a primary US ally. Spink's report says Britain's choice not to retaliate against the steel and aluminium tariffs may aid free trade deal negotiations. But he warns closer economic ties with Beijing could strain relations, particularly Chinese investment in strategic British industries.
AI obviously would be of great interest, semiconductor manufacturing, defense industry, but even the agricultural sector. The security of food is utmost concern for national security.
He said this also includes capital outflows from the City of London to China.
Specifically into dual-use sectors, technology sectors that may actually improve and modernize China's military capabilities.
Instead, he said there is an interest in aligning development policy between the US and UK. Now, after the initial tariff trade war comes to an end, Spink says the world will likely pivot to the question of maintaining economic connectivity in a post-globalization era. He suggested Britain could integrate into the US-Mexico-Canada agreement that would anchor the UK into the North American trade bloc. Meanwhile, a joint US-UK initiative in a post-war Ukraine would reinforce ties while also granting the UK stakes in sectors such as rare earth mining, an essential area for defense and technology, but currently dominated by China. Despite differences in political outlook between Trump and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Spink says Trump is an Anglophile or someone who loves Britain, and that this closeness of cultures plays to the UK's advantage.
I believe there is a kinship, and most importantly, as an Anglophile, the president views the security of the hemisphere with utmost importance.
He said that strategic alignment on shared security and economic interests will be the key to preserving the strength and relevance of the US-UK alliance. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
Coming up in the NFL, it's the league's annual draft with the Tennessee Titans picking first. Dave Martin joins us to discuss when we return. Now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, a lot going on today, but let's start in the NFL as the league's annual draft starts tonight with the first round. Is there a consensus number one pick?
Yeah, pretty much. Most people think Cam Ward, quarterback out of Miami, is going to go first overall to the Tennessee Titans. That's according to rumors and, of course, according to the betting odds. Now, after him, most people actually think Travis Hunter, the defensive back and wide receiver who won the Heisman Trophy, is going to go second overall. That would be to the Cleveland Browns. Now, personally, a while back, I thought Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback from Colorado, would go there because Cleveland looked like they might have a need for a quarterback, and Sanders was a very good one for Colorado. Somehow, though, he seems to be fallen out of favor. He's kind of fallen down the projected draft boards. We'll have to see, though, what happens tonight. Of course, every year there are always surprises in the draft. Someone goes where you wouldn't expect them to go, and they might take a fall in the draft. I mean, that actually happened to Aaron Rodgers about 20 years ago, which is how Green Bay got him. But anyway, for tonight, not every team actually has a first-round pick. No one's actually traded their first-round pick yet. I would think once the actual draft starts, you're going to see plenty of trades going on. Anyway, the NFL draft starts at 8 p.m. tonight. Tonight is just the first round, and then they got rounds 2 and 3 Friday, and the rest on Saturday.
While looking at collegiate sports news, the proposed billion-dollar settlement that would allow the NCAA to directly pay their players could be held up so it can be reworked. What's at issue here?
Yeah, it seems like it's the school roster limits. Now, previously, you just had scholarship limits that kind of like determined how many players were on, football, basketball, baseball teams, whatever. So the big question is then, what happens to non-scholarship players or walk-ons? So schools, of course, they're following this case, and this has been proposed, these changes, but they haven't been finalized yet. So schools have already been making some of these changes in preparation for next year. But the judge has actually ordered the parties to redo now this part of the plan. Now this is U.S. District Judge Claudia Wilkinson, quote, "Any disruption may occur is a problem of the defendants and member schools' own making." So anyway, the defense is trying to say, well, these are already in progress, these changes, and she's like, well, this has not been finalized. So she gave the two sides 14 days to do their bargaining. Now these two sides, one represents the schools and the NCAA, the other represents current and former players. So I mean, from a fan's perspective, I would like them to see, the non-scholarship players continue. You would see a lot of those non-scholarship players sometimes ending up earning a scholarship. Sometimes they end up being good enough to play in the pros. So certainly, I'm hoping they find a way to keep this. So stay tuned.
Well, moving now to NBA news, the Golden State Warriors All-Star Jimmy Butler left last night's game with a pelvic contusion and didn't return. What is his status going forward? Yeah, the Warriors have not said yet. Now, he has an MRI scheduled for today, and probably after that, we'll find out. As you can see there, he's in a lot of pain. Now, what happened yesterday, look how high he is there, too. He gets undercut, going up for a rebound accidentally. It looks like a guy, Ahmed Thompson, got pushed into him. So you can see your Butler falls there to the ground, so that's where he got the pelvic contusion. Looks very painful there. Let's actually listen to what one of his teammates said here. This is rookie Quentin Post here.
I mean, he means a lot to us, obviously. I mean, when he went out, it kind of took the wind out of our sails a little bit. But I thought we fought back. We put up a good fight, and we'll be ready for Game 3. That the playoffs is very physical, and I got to be better personally, moving my feet, and got to get more physical boxing out. And as a team, we'll bounce back. We'll be ready for Game 3.
Yeah, his presence has been huge for the Warriors this year. Before they traded for him, this is back in early February, their record was 25-26. They're 25-9 since that includes the playoffs and one game that Butler didn't play, which they actually lost. Now, not only does he take a lot of scoring pressure off of Steph Curry, he's a great defensive player. In fact, the Warriors have the best defense in the league since that time. Now, fortunately for the Warriors, in the playoffs, because of TV, the games are a lot more spread out, so this might actually help them out. Now, their next game is Saturday, Game 3, in a series tied at 1.
Well, tonight's busy sports schedule not only includes the NFL draft, but there are also 3 NBA and 4 NHL playoff games on.
Yeah. The first NHL playoff game actually just started. It started at 6:30 there. That's Florida, the defending champion, Florida Panthers, taking on the Tampa Bay Lightning, so a couple of in-state rivals. This is actually the 4th time in the last 5 years these two have squared off. Tampa Bay won the first 2. Florida, though, won last year. Now, at 7 o'clock then, this is Eastern time, obviously. Ottawa plays Toronto in a series tied at, no wait, Ottawa is down 2-0, excuse me. 9 p.m. Eastern, we have Minnesota hosting Las Vegas. That series is tied at 1. And then at 9:30, St. Louis and Winnipeg Blues have a 2-0 lead there. Then to the NBA playoffs, New York is at Detroit starting at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Then we've got Memphis hosting Oklahoma City. Memphis is down 2-0 in that series. That's at 9:30. And finally, 10 o'clock, the Denver Nuggets and LA Clippers play Game 3 in a series tied up at 1. So, Tiff, got a whole lot of sports going on tonight, though, because, sports matters.
It does indeed. You can see it behind you right there. All Davis, always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tiff.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com/live or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.